Okay, how's it going, everybody? I hope you're all doing well. Okay, well, so in today's episode, I thought I'd try to say something about the philosopher Byung-Chul Han's new book called The Crisis of Narration, published just this year. Okay, so what's the work about? Well, as the title says, there is a crisis of narration today. We live in a post-narrative time, Han says. And this is why we feel so lost today and without any identity. It's because without narrative, everything appears contingent to us and there's no cohesion. Everything is adrift. Now, instead of narrative, we have something else. What we have is information. Lots of it. Information has replaced narrative. But information doesn't help us with meaning and with orientation. As Han says, we might be super informed, but that doesn't provide us with any sense or direction. And that's because all information is, he says, is additive or cumulative. Information just keeps adding to itself, but it doesn't give us any order or boundaries or closure. It doesn't give us an anchor. It doesn't give us a story to live by. It doesn't give us a home in the world. Instead, we are lost, adrift in a tsunami of information. We are lost in a amorphous sea of data where there are no distinctions and where nothing stands out. Now, it's for this reason that narrative is important. It's because, as Han says, narrative narrates contingency away. It turns what's accidental into something that's necessary and meaningful. And here, Han mentions religion as an example of a meaningful narrative. What religion does, being a meta-narrative, is it punctuates time with meaning. Rituals and holidays and festivities makes days meaningful and life feels anchored in something. In other words, as Han says, with religious narrative, life moves from an endless and meaningless schedule of appointments to days freighted with meaning, to a life full of highlights and markers of orientation. Okay, so that's sort of Han's basic introduction to his work. But now let's get into some of the details. So what are some of the important differences between information and narration, and why are they important? Well, first of all, narrative, as opposed to information, depends on selection. It depends on remembering events and then connecting them together. But that also means that some events are going to be left out. It means that there are some gaps. Well, this is not the case with information. With information, it's all about getting as much of a record as possible about everything. It's about closing all gaps. It's about getting as much data as possible. As Han says, it's about getting a complete record of life, building a total data set. Now, notice something. Notice that there's no selection and no reflection here. There's just accumulation. There's no story, no thread that binds. No, there's just an infinite list of disconnected events. Actually, you know what? This reminds me a bit of something that Albert Camus talks about in his great work, The Rebel. So in that book, he has a chapter on art, and it's really interesting. What he says there is that what's characteristic of the greatest art is that it's a stylization of reality. In other words, for him, what artists do is they revolt against the contingency and disorder of life, and they reconstruct the world according to their own selection. I mean, think about a novel, something that Camus talks about. The author of a novel doesn't write about every single detail in a character's life. He or she, they don't try to describe every single thing about crude reality. No, that wouldn't be art, would it? It would just be an endless list of items and events in the world. Instead, what artists or authors do is they select certain things and leave other things out. And they do this in order to try to bring a unity and a completion to the work that it otherwise wouldn't have if the goal was just a pure description of things or some sort of record of the totality of the world. In Camus' own words, what the novel gives us is a rectification of the world that we live in. It gives us a universe where life assumes the aspect of a destiny. Anyway, so back to Han. So maybe another way of coming at this is by making the distinction, as Han does, between quantity and quality. So what does that mean exactly? Well, Han gives the example of this ever-increasing project that we have today of self-tracking. You know, when we fit our bodies with all sorts of gadgets and sensors to try to generate data about our health, like our blood pressure or heart rates or sleep patterns, where a detailed log is kept of everything that's going on with our physiology and even with our mental health. We then, as Han says, collect or aggregate all of this data and have it displayed to us in some summarizing graph. And that's our version of self-knowledge today. Self-knowledge for us is a total record of our bodies and minds. Now it's all about numbers. It's all about measurement. It's all about quantification. We are the sum of our numbers. But as Han says, in truth, this has absolutely nothing to do with who we are, with our identities, or with self-knowledge. No, and that's because, as Han says, the self is not a quantity, but it's a quality. In other words, how we come to know ourselves is through narration and reflection, not through some numerical record. Actually, related to this, there's something else that Han says that's very interesting in this regard. What he says is that we have this mania over optimization. But here's the thing. What does optimization and efficiency really have to do with narrative, with quality? As Han says, narrative or story is intrinsically valuable and meaningful, and it's not something that can be optimized. More and greater and more efficiency and productivity, this is all meaningless. It speaks of a meaningless and manic world, says Han. Actually, this reminds me of something that the sociologist Max Weber talked about in reference to Tolstoy's great book, Anna Karenina. So what Weber asks is what exactly death amounts to in modern life, in a capitalistic and technological world. I mean, in a world built by competition, there is always going to be someone else to outdo, right? And in a materialistic world, there's always something else to get. And in a world marked by progress, there is always something more to achieve. So when does it end? Well, it doesn't. In a world dominated by a pathological push for unending, infinite progress, when is enough enough? Well, obviously never. Now, given all this, when is one's life complete then? Well, it's not. It's never sufficient unto itself. Well, this is why death is nothing but a problem for modern man. For us moderns, death is always really just a kind of incompleteness. Death is bad because it prevents us from doing and being more. But to get back to Anna Karenina, this is not so for Tolstoy's peasants in that story. Simply put, they can have enough of life and so be acquainted with death. On the eve of their days, they can die old and satiated with life. And they can do this because they see themselves as part of an organic cycle of life and not as separate from it. Now, this is the deeper unconscious wisdom of Tolstoy's peasants. That at the end of the day, it is a sense of completion that makes death truly meaningful, and so life ultimately fulfilling. And to go back to Han, you can't have this completion without a story, without a narrative. And that's because a story, unlike pure information, is bounded. It has a beginning and an end. And so for that reason, it has the very thing that information can't give us: coherence and meaning. Bye for now.